Chapter 4. The Feudal System. General Principles' Influence on People. In accounting for the Crusades, we must consider the governmental condition of Europe at the time. Under no other system than that of feudalism would it have been possible to unify and mobilize the masses for the great adventure. Had Europe then been dominated by several great rulers, each with a nation at his control, as the case has been in subsequent times, even the popes would have been unable to combine the various forces in any enterprise that was not purely spiritual. Just to the extent in which the separate nationalities have developed their autonomy has the secular influence of the Roman See been lessened. Kings and emperors, whenever they have felt themselves strong enough to do so, have resented the leadership of Rome in matters having temporal bearings, nor would the mutual jealousies of the rulers themselves have allowed them to unite in any movement for the common glory, since the most urgent calls have never been sufficient to unite them even for the common defense, as is shown by the supineness of Catholic Europe, when, in the 15th century, the Turks crossed the Marmora and assailed Constantinople. But in the 11th century there was no strong national government in Europe. Kingship and imperialism existed rather in name than in such power as we are accustomed to associate with the words. At the opening of the 10th century, France was parcelled out into 29 petty states, each controlled by its feudal lord. Hugh Capet, 987-996, succeeded in temporarily combining under his sceptre these fragments of Charlemagne's estate, but his successors were unable to perpetuate the common dominion. In the year 1000, there were 55 great Frankish lords who were independent of the nominal sovereign. Indeed, some of these nobles exercised authority more weighty than that of the throne. Louis XVIII first succeeded in making his lordly vassals respect his kingship, but his domain was small. Ile-de-France, properly so called, and a part of Orléans, pretty nearly the 5 departments of the Seine, French Vexin, half the countship of Sens, and the countship of Bourges. Such was the whole of it, but this limited state was as liable to agitation, and often as troublous and toilsome to govern, as the very greatest of modern states. It was full of petty lords, almost sovereign in their own estates, and sufficiently strong to struggle against their kingly suzerain, who had, besides, all around his domains, several neighbours more powerful than himself in the extent and population of their states. In Spain, much of the land was still held by the Moors. That which had been wrested from them was divided among the Christian heroes who conquered it, and who, though feudal rules were not formally recognized, held it with an aristocratic pretension, commensurate with the leagues they shadowed with their swords. In Germany, though imperialism had been established firmly by Otho the Great, the throne was forced to continual compromise with the ambition of its chief vassals, like the dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia. A papal appeal to such magnates was sufficient at any time to paralyze, or at least to neutralize, the imperial authority. The imperial authority, the Norman holdings in the south of Italy, the independence of the cities of Lombardy in the north, the claims of the German emperor and of the popes to landed control, were typical of the divisions of that unhappy peninsula. Later than the age we are studying, Frederick Barbarossa, 1152-90, enjoined that, in every oath of fealty to an inferior lord, the vassal's duty to the emperor should be expressly reserved. But it was not so elsewhere. When Henry, 1154-89, and Richard, 1189-99, claimed lands in France, their French vassals never hesitated to adhere to these English lords, nor do they appear to have incurred any blame On that account, St. Louis, 1226-70, declared in his laws that if justice be refused by the king to one of his vassals, the vassal may summon his own tenants, under penalty of forfeiting their fiefs, to assist him in obtaining redress by arms. The extent to which the French barons were independent of the throne will be evident from a glance at their privileges. They possessed, unchallenged, the right of coining money. In Hugh Capet's time there were 150 independent mints in the realm, the right of waging private war. Every castle was a fortress, always equipped as in a state of siege. Immunity from taxation, except that the king was provided with entertainment on his journeys. The crown had no revenue beyond that coming from the personal estates of its occupant. Freedom from all legislative control. Lawmaking ceased with the capitularies of Carloman in 882. The first renewal of the attempt at general legislation was not until the time of Louis in 1223. Even St. Louis declared in his establishments that the king could make no laws for the territories of the barons without their consent. But if such was the independence of the feud holder in his relations to the sovereign, those beneath him were in absolute dependence upon their lord. This is seen in the following obligations of feudal tenants to their superior. Reliefs, sums of money due from everyone coming of age and taking a fief by inheritance, fines upon alienation or change of tenant ownership. Escheats, reversion to the lord of all property, upon a tenant's dying without natural heirs, or upon any delinquency of service. In the sales, contributions levied in special emergency, as the Lord's expedition to the Holy Land, the marriage of his sister, eldest son or daughter, his paying a relief to his overlord, making his son a knight, or redeeming his own person from captivity, wardship of tenant during minority. This involved on the part of the lord the right to select a husband for a female dependent, which alliance could be declined only on payment of a fine equal to that which anyone desiring the woman could be induced to offer. If the feudal system pressed so harshly upon those who were themselves of high rank, it need not be said that the common people were utterly crushed by this accumulation of graded despotisms, whose whole weight rested ultimately on the lowest stratum. The mass of the lowly was divided into three orders: freemen possessing small tracts of allodial land, so called because held by original occupancy and not yet merged in the larger holdings. There were many freemen in the 5th and 6th centuries, but in the 10th century nearly all the land of Europe had become feudal. The freemen, whose possessions were small, soon found it necessary to surrender land and liberty for the sake of protection by some neighbouring lord. Villeins or serfs, who were attached to the land and transferable with it on change of owners. Slaves. The degradation of the servile class was limitless, the master having the right of life and death, entire use of the property and wages of his people, and absolute disposal of them in marriage. Slavery was abolished in France by Louis the Gross in 1037, so far as respected the inhabitants of cities, but it took nearly 2 centuries more to accomplish the abolition of servitude throughout the kingdom. The cities were, indeed, rising to assert their communal, if not manhood, rights. The communes, as they were called, demanded and received privilege in certain places of electing any persons to membership as citizens who were guaranteed absolute ownership of property. But the communes were far from even suggesting anything like the modern democratic systems, and were opposed by clergy and nobility. So that, security could hardly be purchased save at the price of liberty. Liberty was then so stormy and so fearful that people conceived, if not a disgust for it, at any rate a horror of it. Men had not evolved the morality which could make a commonwealth. Law was bound on men only by force. The wall of the castle, grand and impressive as wealth could build it, or only a rude addition to the natural rock, was the sole earthly object of reverence. Oh, the strong man came the weak, saying, "Let me be yours, protect me, and I will fight for you." It will be evident that under the feudal system patriotism, in the modern sense of attachment to one's national domain, can scarcely be said to have existed, while we may not believe recent French writers who assert that the love of their country as such was born with the Revolution 100 years ago. It is certain that the medieval attachment was no wider than to one's immediate neighbourhood. The crusading Count of Flanders, on viewing the desolate hills about Jerusalem, exclaimed, "I am astonished that Jesus Christ could have lived in such a desert. I prefer my big castle in my district of Arras. His love of the peasant seems to have been only for his familiar hills and vineyards, and his loyalty was limited by the protecting hand of his lord. Yet generous spirits could not remain for ever so narrowly bounded in their interests. Men were ready to hear the call to a wider range of sympathies and actions. The summons for the Crusades thus furnished the lacking sentiment of patriotism, but it was a patriotism that could not be bounded by the Rhine or the Danube, by the Channel or the Pyrenees. Europe was country. Christendom was fatherland. At the same time, the compactness of each feud, the close interdependence of lord and vassal, furnished the condition for the organization of bands of fighting men, ready to move at once and to continue the enterprise so long as the means of the superior should hold out. There was needed to start the crusading armies no council of parliament or alliance of nations, hazarded and delayed by the varied policies of different courts. If the baron was inclined to obey the call of his ghostly superior, the successor of St. Peter, his retainers were ready to march, and the most brawling of the barons was superstitious enough to think that the voice of the Pope might be the voice of God. If he did not, his retainers did, and disobedience to the papal will might cost him the obedience of those subject to him. Besides, many of the feudal lords were themselves in clerical orders, with their oath of fealty lying at the feet of the Holy Father. Thus Europe, though divided into many factions, and indeed, because the factions were so many, was in a condition to be readily united. We shall see in a subsequent chapter that it was in the interest of the Holy See to apply the spring which should combine and set in motion these various communities as but parts of that gigantic piece of ecclesiastical and military mechanism invented by Hildebrand. Chapter 5. The impoverished condition of Europe. The once luxuriant civilization of Rome had been swept away by the northern invaders as completely as a freshet despoils the fields when it not only destroys standing vegetation, but carries with the debris the soil itself. The most primitive arts, those associated with agriculture, were forgotten, and the rudiments of modern industries were not thought of. Much of the once cultivated land had, as has elsewhere been noted, reverted to native forest and marsh, and in places was still being purchased by strangers on titles secured by occupancy and first improvement, as now in the new territories of America. But even nature's pity for man was outraged. The bounty she gave from half-tilled acres was despoiled by men themselves, as hungry children snatch the morsels of charity from one another's hand. What was hoarded for personal possession became the spoil of petty robbers, and what was left by the neighborhood marauder was destroyed in the incessant baronial strife. To these devouring forces must be added the desolating wars between the papal and imperial powers, the conquest and reconquest of Spain by Moors and Christians, and the despoiling of Saxon England by the Normans throughout Europe. Fields, cottages, castles, oftentimes churches, were stripped by the vandalism which had seemingly become a racial disposition. To this ordinary impoverished condition was added the especial misery, about 1195, of several years' failure of crops. Famine stalked through France and Middle Europe. The villages were depopulated. Cruel as they were, men grew weary of raiding one another's possessions when there was nothing to bring back but wounds. Even hatred palled when unsupported by envy and cupidity. The Crusades gave promise of opening a new world to greed. The stories that were told of Eastern riches grew as repeated from tongue to tongue, until fable seemed poor in comparison with what was believed to be fact. All the wealth of antiquity was presumed to be still stored in treasure vaults, which the magic key of the cross would unlock. The impoverished baron might exchange his half-ruined castle for some splendid estate beyond the Action, and the vulgar crowd, if they did not find Jerusalem paved with gold like the heavenly city, would assuredly tread the veins of rich mines or rest among the flowers of an earthly paradise. The Mohammedan's expectation of a sensual heaven after death was matched by the Christian's anticipation of what awaited him while still in life. They who were uninfluenced by this prospect may have seized the more warrantable hope of opening profitable traffic with the Orient. The maritime cities of Italy had for a long time harvested great gains in the eastern Mediterranean. In spite of the Moslem interruptions of commerce, would not a tide of wealth pour westward, if only the swords of the Christians could hew down its barriers? The Church piously, but nonetheless shrewdly, stimulated the sense of economy or greed by securing exemption from taxation to all who should enlist, and putting a corresponding burden of excise upon those who remained at home, whose estates were assessed to pay the expenses of the absent. The householder, who found it difficult to save his possessions while keeping personal guard over them, was assured that all his family and effect would be under the watchful protection of the Church, with anathemas already forged against any who should molest them. If one were without means, he might borrow to the limit of his zeal, with exemption from interest. It was understood that the Jews were still under necessity of paying back the 30 pieces of silver with which they had bought the Christian's law, the interest on which, compounded through the centuries, was now equal in amount to all there might be in the vaults of this accursed race. When we remember the wars of modern times which have originated in the cupidity of men, we are not surprised that the same disposition, inflamed by the sense of dire need at home and the vision of untold treasures outre-mer, with heavenly rewards beyond the sky, should have led to the same result in an age that knew almost nothing of the arts of peace. Chapter 6. The Papal Policy Demoralization of the World, and the Church Hildebrand's purpose inherited by his successors. We shall fail to appreciate the inception of the Crusades if we overlook the influence of the papal policy in the Middle Ages. These movements of Europe against Asia, being under the direct patronage of the popes, facilitated the plans of Rome to consolidate and universalize the ecclesiastical empire. To understand this policy, we must recall the condition of the Church in its relation to popular life and the secular powers. We have referred to the fact that the year 1000 had been looked forward to as that which should mark the end of the world. So common was the expectation of this termination of human affairs that many charters which have been preserved from this period begin with the words, "As the world is now drawing to its close." When, however, the fatal day passed without any perceptible shock to the universe, the popular credulity added the 33 years of the life of our Lord to the calculation and prolonged the gruesome foreboding. But if the chronological interpretation of the prophecy of the book of Revelation was a mistaken one, there was not wanting an apparent fulfillment of the descriptive prediction, "Satan shall be loosed out of his prison." The falsity and viciousness of men certainly took on fiendish proportions. The worst feature of the general demoralization was that the millennial fear had driven all sorts of men into church orders. The priesthood and monasteries were crowded with wretched characters whose imagined immunity in their sacred refuges gave license to their carnal vices. The clergy were no longer the shepherds, but the bellwethers of the wayward flock. Priests lived in open concubinage. When Hildebrand, previous to his elevation to the papacy, took charge of the monastery of St. Paul in Rome, his first work was to drive out the cattle that were stabled in the basilica, and the prostitutes who served the tables of the monks. Courtesans reigned even in the palaces of the popes, with more effrontery than in the courts of the secular princes. The offspring of such creatures as the infamous Theodora, and of her daughters Theodora and Marozia, had, in the 10th century, purchased the tiara with their vices. In those days, the papal staff was wrenched by violence from the hands that held it with more frequency than the old Roman sceptre had been stolen in the worst days of the empire. It may well be credited that men began to pray again to pagan deities in sheer despondency, under the darkness which veiled the Christian truth. The surviving religious sentiment was voiced in the solemn utterance of the Council of Rheims, which declared that the Church was ruled by monsters of iniquity, wanting in all culture, whether sacred or profane. If the 10th century closed with a gleam of hope in the elevation of Gregory, 996, 999, and Sylvester, 999, 1003, it was quickly remembered that the learning of the latter had been acquired among the Saracens, and his biographer attributed his attainments to magic and undue familiarity with the fiends in hell. In the early part of the 11th century, the papal chair was filled with the nominees of politicians, and from 1033 to 1045, disgraced by Benedict, who, at the age of 12, was selected to pose as the vicegerent of God. The lowest vices and caprices of unconscionable youth were enthroned in the place that was most sacred in the thoughts of men. One of his successors, Victor, 1086-87, said of Benedict that he led a life so shameful, so foul and execrable, that it made one shudder to describe it. A man of such grovelling appetites naturally wearied with even the slight usages of decency, which had come to be regarded as necessary in the papal palace, and after 12 years of irksome attempt to support its lessened dignity, he sold his tiara to Gregory VI, an unknown writer, about the middle of the 11th century. Attempting a review of the passing age, exclaimed, "Everything is degenerate, and all is lost. Faith has disappeared. The world has grown old, and must soon cease altogether." As the debasement of the Church could go no lower, a reaction was natural and inevitable, if virtue was not altogether decayed at the roots. The sentiment of human decency reasserted itself, and since there was no power at Rome to inaugurate reform, an appeal was made to the German emperor. Henry, in response to the call, deposed by force 3 rival claimants to the papal throne, and secured the ascendancy of a line of German popes. It was not without the suspicion of poison that 2 of them died after brief power. Clement, within the year, and Damasus the coup in 23 days. With Leo IX, 1049, came a better era, the year 1033, the ultimate date set by the prophecy mongers for the end of the world being clearly past, and men becoming again possessed of hope in the continuance of mundane affairs. The best spirits dare to labor for the renovation of society, that the earth thus saved as by fire might become indeed a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. From this time the commanding genius and pure purpose of Hildebrand guided, if he did not select, the occupants of the seat of St. Peter, until, in 173, the great counsellor himself assumed the sacred sceptre. History, while it severely condemns the methods by which Hildebrand sought to attain his ends, credits him with rigid honesty and devotion to what he believed to be the will of heaven, while it writes into his epitaph the charge of most inordinate ambition. It does not erase from it the record of his utterance as he lay dying, a fugitive at Salerno. I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile. The religious degradation of Christendom afflicted the soul of this truly great man. But whence could come reform? The age was too far gone in its demoralization to wait for recuperation through the slow process of education. Society could not endure another generation of its own putridity. The secular powers were utterly impotent to cope with the gigantic evils that were abroad in every land. Even had they possessed the disposition to champion the virtues, such sovereigns as the King of France, the Emperor of Germany, the new Norman King of England, were altogether engrossed in holding their precarious crowns, surrounded as they were by a multitude of feudal lords, some of whom could collect in their own names a larger force than that which would rise to defend the throne. To Hildebrand, but one course seemed open, a desperate one, whose hazard showed the audacity of the genius that conceived it. It was nothing less than to declare the papacy a world monarchy, and to force universal reform by the combined power of the secular and spiritual sceptre held in his own hand. In his bull against the Emperor Henry IV, he used these words, "Come now, I pray thee, O most holy Father, and ye princes, Saint Peter and Saint Paul, that all the world may know that if ye are able to bind and loose in heaven, ye are able on earth to take away, or to give to each according to his merits, empires, kingdoms, duchies, marquisates, counties, and the possessions of all men. If ye judge in spiritual affairs, how great must be your power in secular. And if ye are to judge angels, who rule over proud princes, what may ye not do to these their servants? Let kings, then, and all the princes of the world learn what ye are, and how great is your power, and fear to treat with disrespect the mandates of the Church. To practicalize this enormous claim, the Pope made two demands which threw Europe into a state of turmoil. He ordered the renunciation of all investitures of religious office by secular potentates. The clergy held of the empire cities, duchies, entire provinces, rights of levying taxes, coinage, etc., amounting to 1/2 of all property. The sees thus held Hildebrand declared to be vacated until their occupants should again receive them from his hand under pledge of absolute obedience to the papal, as opposed to the imperial authority. By this stroke, the Pope would gather to himself the practical control of all countries. Hildebrand forbade the marriage of the clergy, a custom widespread at the time, and commanded those who had entered into matrimony, however innocently and legally, to forsake their wives, as having been but concubines, and their children, since logically they were but bastards. By enforcing the celibacy of the clergy, he would have at his call an army of men without domestic ties, care, or encumbrance, and, so far as possible to human nature, divested of individuality, and thus the pliant agents of a single will. The audacity of Hildebrand's scheme will be noted by comparing it with the attitude of the most devoted adherents to the papal authority previous to his time. The capitularies of Charlemagne contain many rules for the regulation of religious duties. The emperor himself, 794, presided at the Synod of Frankfurt, though a papal legate was in attendance, while he brought the Church all possible help as an ally, and yielded to it all obedience as a private Christian. He never allowed his imperial authority to be under so much as the shadow of control by the papal. He suffered but one religion in his domains, that which had the Pope for its chief administrator. But he held with equal strenuousness that the emperor was the vicar of God in things temporal. From 964 to 1055, the popes had been the direct nominees of the emperor. In 159, the papal election devolved for the first time upon the conclave of cardinals, but the Lateran Council decreed that the imperial confirmation must follow. Though in 1061 Alexander was chosen without imperial sanction, yet in 1073 Hildebrand himself, becoming pope as Gregory, did not venture to discharge the duties of the office without first asking and obtaining the emperor's assent. But this outward deference to the secular power was only that he might grasp more securely the weapon with which he would beat that power to pieces. When the Emperor Henry resented the sweeping claim of the Pope, Hildebrand launched against him all the terrors of the pontifical throne. His bull reads as follows: "Henry and all of his adherents I excommunicate and bind in the fetters of anathema. On the part of Almighty God, I interdict him from the government of all Germany and Italy. I deprive him of all royal power and dignity. I prohibit every Christian from rendering him obedience as king. I absolve all who have sworn or shall swear allegiance to his sovereignty from their oaths." This policy of the papacy to make itself the world monarchy had a direct bearing upon the Crusades and facilitated the enterprise. The astute mind of Hildebrand saw that a movement which should combine the Catholics of all countries in Europe under his command would immensely augment his prestige as their great overlord. During his pontificate, there opportunely arrived at Rome messengers from the Greek emperor at Constantinople, beseeching the aid of Western Christendom in expelling the Turks, who were menacing the capital of the East. Hildebrand, consistently with his policy, prescribed as the condition of such aid the recognition on the part of the Greek Church of the headship of the Roman pontiff. But in this demand he overshot the mark, while at the same time the apathy of the Latin Christians towards their Greek brethren, and his own controversy with the German emperor, left him no opportunity to launch the movement. It was left to Urban Tatau, his second successor in the pontificate, to undertake the great adventure. As Dean Milman remarks, "So no event could be more favourable or more opportune for the advancement of the great papal object of ambition, the acknowledged supremacy over Latin Christendom, or for the elevation of Urban himself over the rival pope, Guibert, and the temporal sovereign, his enemies."